Hello everyone, and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. This is JM, and I am here with my co-hosts Nate and Gretchen. Hey guys, how's everything going?
It's going well.
Yeah, I'm doing good too.
That's great.
I've got a spring break, so I'm having a good time just relaxing.
Yeah, here in Toronto, it's a very warm, almost presaging spring kind of day, so nice contrast to the last recording we did, which was during quite frigid times.
Yeah.
Things are kind of returning to pre-corona time levels of activity, as I was explaining a little bit earlier. I went out of the city last week and had a really good time and came back feeling pretty refreshed, even though my D&D character died a very horrible death. I was still personally refreshed. So it's been really good. So I think we have a really fun episode today because all the stories are really interesting and I would say mostly really, really good. So we'll just get into a little bit of background about our podcast. We are, as previously mentioned, a science fiction literature podcast, and you can find us on the web in many different locations. We're on all your favorite podcasting apps. I figured out the other day that I could just say, hey, Google, play Chrononauts podcast, and it will. So you can do that too. We also have a blog spot at chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com where you can find some translations of stories that are not available anywhere else, as well as first reproductions of a few tales, including one that we're covering tonight, which I believe is available elsewhere digitally, but not very good copy. So if you want to read The Runaway World before listening to us talk about it, that's where you can go. And we'll also have some items up for the next podcast coming up next month.
Yeah.
And you can, of course, leave us comments on any of our platforms or shoot us an email at chrononautspodcast@gmail.com. Without further ado, let's get into what we're going to be talking about today, which is weird fiction. Now, this is certainly a topic that's quite dear to my heart, and I think that we all kind of dabble in this field a little bit. I would say that my discovery of science fiction probably predates my discovery of so-called weird fiction, which we have some trouble defining as a genre, but we can try and sort of do it. So, what is weird fiction? Well, Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft that is, who remains to this day probably the most well-known purveyor of the so-called weird, certainly had some pretty formal things to say about it. Michael Moorcock, a well-known fantasist from more modern times, that is starting roughly in the 1960s and going through to today, has written a pretty good introduction to this massive compilation edited by Ann and Jeff VanderMeer called The Weird, which attempts to document the history of weird fiction from 1900 till the early 2000s. And Moorcock says there might not really be any rules. He says it could be anything from absurdism to horror, or even social realism with a twist in reality. And I think it's that twist in reality that is important to the weird tale. And it seems that an interesting way in which this subject melds with our science fiction field is that a good number of writers who became known as science fiction writers actually got their start writing weird tales. And Fritz Leiber had been discussing with Moorcock this subject and told of how he had been talking with Henry Kuttner and Robert Bloch, two pretty well-known American writers from basically the 40s and 50s and beyond. And they had explained to him that they had started writing unrationalized tales, but the commercial markets demanded explanations and reasons. And it came to the point where the tendency to write weird, that is, unrationalized tales, was seen as a little bit of a weakness by those authors in their own work. So I thought that was quite interesting. One thing we can, I think, mostly agree on is that a weird story is designed to disturb in some way. It's not necessarily the same as to horrify or frighten. It can be quite subtle and complex when compared with, I guess you could term, regular horror. Now, Lovecraft, who we'll be talking about quite a bit today, defined a weird tale as something that has a supernatural element, but does not fall into the category of traditional ghost or gothic tale. And he said this in his famous essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature. That essay is something that he wrote in the mid-1920s, essentially describing his idea of a weird tale. So even though the title of the essay is in fact Supernatural Horror in Literature, what he really does is spend a lot of time talking about the weird tale as he defines it. And he goes through its history. He talks about writers from the past who influenced him, and he also discusses some of the contemporary writers of the day that he was reading, including writers who ended up in Weird Tales magazine, where most of his initial stories were published. Well, a good number of them, anyway. This is what he had to say. I'm just going to pull up a couple more quotes from him that he used to define this, because even though, as I would like to demonstrate shortly, it does seem like the weird tale has come a bit of a way since Lovecraft and incorporated perhaps a more broad spectrum of influences, so that the stereotypical idea that most people have of the weird tale, which is the Lovecraft-style story with a lot of tentacles and secret societies and stuff in it, is not necessarily indicative of the entire style. But I still think that what he had to say is quite relevant, especially considering the time period of stories that we're going to be covering today. So here's one of the things he had to say in this essay. The true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or sheeted form clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer, unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. So I still think that's pretty good. I think that it doesn't necessarily lead one to conclude, oh, so this is a very specific definition that pertains to the Lovecraft style of story. I don't think that's the case. According to H.P. Lovecraft scholar S.T. Joshi, who's not just a Lovecraft scholar really, but essentially a champion of the weird, and has been so since the 1970s or 1980s, he says that there are 4 categories or subtypes that can be grouped into weird fiction. And that doesn't mean that all stories belonging to these categories are weird fiction per se, but weird fiction can be subgrouped according to these 4. So he says the 4 categories are fantasy, supernatural horror, non-supernatural horror, and what he terms quasi-science fiction. I'm not really a fan of the quasi, but I can see sort of why he put it there, because I'm not sure that he's too much of a science fiction fan himself. And a lot of the weird tales, I guess, scribes from back in the day, there was definitely a weird thing going on with the pulps in terms of their perceived literary quality or lack thereof, and a certain amount of, I guess, castigation at the time of magazines like Amazing Stories, which we'll get into much later in a different podcast episode. But H.P. Lovecraft had one of his most famous stories, The Color Out of Space, published in Amazing, and that is pretty clearly a science fiction story. So not all these things, although not all these groups might necessarily be considered weird by default. And I think that, obviously, since this is the Chrononauts podcast, what we think of as the science fiction element is particularly interesting. So, I guess, as an opening, I would like to ask the question, is that perhaps, as Joshi terms, quasi-science fictional element, is that something that attracted us to the weird in the first place? I would say for me that's definitely the case. I don't remember, so we're going to be talking about Lovecraft some more. He's our next and first story, so we might as well just go on about him a little more. I think that when I first started reading Lovecraft stories, it was in this book. I actually got these 3, not concurrently, not at the same time, but I got these 3 books, and they were editions of the original. I think they were published by Arkham House in the 60s and then reprinted. And they were the original, official compilations of Lovecraft's oeuvre that were sort of well put together and curated according to his actual manuscripts. So I guess you could say they were the first true legitimate editions. And these were books, The Dunwich Horror and Other Stories, Dagon and Other Macabre Tales, and At the Mountains of Madness and Other Novels. So I've read these three probably within the space of a year or two. And the first one was The Dunwich Horror and Other Stories. And I remember thinking to myself, at first, these are ghostly horror stories and they're creepy tales. And then as I was reading more and more through the book, I started seeing more and more science fiction, which I was already a fan of. So I thought to myself, oh, that's really cool. He's like sort of mixing the genres in an interesting way and in writing in this sort of faux antiquated style. And, you know, I don't necessarily know how critical I was of Lovecraft at that time because I was quite young. But I still thought it was really interesting, and I definitely have looked for more of that kind of border crossing ever since. And I saw it in some of Michael Moorcock's books as well. So I thought that was really cool. What about you guys? Do you think that is a particularly attractive aspect of what the weird can do?
Yeah, I definitely think that is an aspect that attracted me to Lovecraft. It's funny because I think the first few stories that I read by Lovecraft are ones that perhaps aren't necessarily the most science fiction oriented of his tales. The first one I remember reading was Pickman's Model, that I read online, and I also read The Shunned House, which of course, as someone who is a fan of haunted house tales, that was one that really captured my interest. But then, you know, I started reading like The Reanimator and some of his other, I read Dagon and Call of Cthulhu, and I started to realize more of that science fiction aspect of his work. And that was how I kind of first heard his name, was in relation more to a science fiction than anything else. So I do think that is a part of the reason why I was attracted to Lovecraft.
Yeah, the science fiction element didn't really dawn on me until I had read a fair amount of his work. I initially came across him not through literary references, but through music, you know, getting into metal like Metallica and Morbid Angel. You know, you can't escape Lovecraft references and things like that. So I figured if those guys like him, then he must be pretty cool. So I always associated with him like the horror thing in my mind. And I read a fair amount of his stories, again, online in high school. And it wasn't until, I guess, later, like after I got out of college, that I really read the bulk of his work. It was a while ago, so I'm not entirely sure if I've read all of them. I don't think so, but I've read a fair amount. Again, it was on like a website online that had a fair amount of them posted that I read it from. But after reading a fair amount, I had seen some commentary online that does talk about the science fiction elements of some of the stories. And thinking about it, it's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I can definitely see that. What struck me about some of the other stories is the fantasy element, especially of like the dream world stuff. And I thought that was a really striking fantasy world, especially in contrast with modern fantasy that's derived from like Tolkien and medieval Europe and knights and stuff like that. Lovecraft's dream world stuff is just so far disconnected from a lot of where the genre has gone since then. So I thought that was really interesting. But as far as the quasi science fiction angle that a lot of these weird tales do have, I think it really does fit in with our podcast and the material we've covered so far, especially in the last two episodes. I think there's a lot of proto weird fiction and stories occupying that kind of gray zone between science fiction, horror, and fantasy that a lot of these weird tales do kind of sit in. So yeah, I think doing this episode is a really important set of stories for the formation of how the genres would take shape afterwards. Lovecraft is certainly by far the most popular figure that we're ever likely going to cover on this podcast. I mean, maybe Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is well known, but again, most people think of like the Universal movie when they think of Frankenstein in their minds. I think comparatively few people have read the novel compared to how much stuff there is out there in the popular culture. But
I was wondering if H.G. Wells would trump Lovecraft in terms of popularity, but maybe not.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, people obviously know The Time Machine and War of the Worlds, but like Lovecraft has just so many references in other places in pop culture. I mean, in music, there's like tabletop board games, countless video games and things like that, that while Wells and Verne, they definitely have their place in the genre's history and the pop culture angle, I don't think even to War of the Worlds and the Time Machine or like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you see like that many references as you do to Lovecraft, or at least the idea of Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to bring up. I feel like now in 2022, when we're talking about it, you're probably right. But even during the time when I got into Lovecraft, and I guess it doesn't matter really when somebody gets into something except for the point of historical reference, but I think that it was earlier, Nate, for me, because I actually got into metal and stuff several years after reading most of Lovecraft's stories.
Yeah.
So, and it was the early 90s, and nobody was talking about him.
No. Yeah, that's one interesting thing about him, is that he seems to have experienced a major critical and popular resurgence sometime in the 80s and really ramping up in the 90s. I think for like a lot of the 50s to the 70s period, there wasn't really much going on with Lovecraft in terms of scholarship. There was a couple film adaptations and references here and there in like popular media.
But even with the film adaptations, they sometimes had to like pretend it was a Poe story or something.
Yeah, right.
Like in Roger Corman's The Haunted Palace, which is not really based on any Poe story at all, but on H.P. Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. But they didn't think it would sell, which is interesting. And both Joshi and Lovecraft biographer W. Scott Poole have brought up something that I thought was a little bit interesting, in that they mentioned that the weird story as a form that is not a genre, but the idea or the feeling that you get when you read a weird story, when you know you're reading a weird story, has been around for a very long time, and definitely predates the sort of designation of a weird tale. And a lot of those tales were quite mainstream, especially from various English writers, but also American writers. And a lot of their stuff was published by major publishing houses and slick magazines. But then things like the Lovecraft, so-called Lovecraft Circle, and the Weird Tales magazine came around. And what Joshi sort of supposes is that this sort of thing is what pushed the weird tale underground, and that before that it was actually quite mainstream. And then a lot of Lovecraft's, especially the British antecedents like Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood, were being published by major publishing houses, whereas the authors who were published in Weird Tales were not. And because this was sort of seen as a breeding ground for the weird tale, especially in the 20s and 30s, other avenues tended to leave this area alone and not touch it. And I don't know if I can back that up and say that, yes, it's 100% true, but it makes a sort of sense. And that somebody like Lovecraft, who was ultimately, even though he had certain ideas about being an 18th century gentleman, a lot of that was a put on, but it was something that he put on pretty effectively throughout his life. People sort of knew him as this old-fashioned conservative guy who was sort of stuck in the past, and it was something that he appreciated actually fostering, perhaps more than it was actually true. But somebody like him, who is a pulp writer, and who gathered about him a huge amount of, I guess, respect among a small community, and wrote letters to hundreds and hundreds of people. The level of correspondence that H.P. Lovecraft has dwarfs his actual fiction output. And Joshi at least believes that some of his best insights and ideas about fiction writing and about other areas of interest actually lie in his correspondence, which most people, of course, will never read. Only the people who are most interested in him would ever read something like that.
Yeah.
The idea that perhaps something like the niche interest of Weird Tales magazine actually sort of creating the underground phenomenon of the weird tale, but sort of pushing it out of the mainstream for a good number of decades, is an interesting one, and might sort of account for the fact that, yeah, it took Lovecraft a long time to be recognized in any kind of critical sense. But it also applies to a lot of the writers that preceded him who were once quite popular, like Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood and Ambrose Bierce and Robert Chambers. So it is interesting. There's a sort of a weird evolution and stuff going on here. And there was, of course, Also, in the non-English speaking world, weird fiction was being published, even if it wasn't necessarily recognized as a genre or anything like that. We are going to talk about Weird Tales magazine, because Weird Tales magazine is the famous magazine where many American and some British weird authors got their start, or were nurtured, or used it as a sort of springboard to move on to other things. This magazine is quite an institution, and it began in 1923 under the auspices of the Rural Publishing Corporation. They had previously created another major pulp called Detective Tales, but surprisingly, perhaps due to burgeoning competition as the detective story was extremely popular at this time, that magazine did not do too well, and the head of the publisher, Jacob Henneberger, decided to start a second magazine, and as a fan of Edgar Allan Poe's work, he thought he knew just the thing. So, the original Weird Tales ran for 279 issues between March 1923 and September of 1954. And the magazine was bought and changed hands a couple of times, once to Popular Publishing in 1924 and then to Short Stories Incorporated in 1938. None of these transitions seem to have really affected the magazine over much. It did change sizes a couple of times, and it did sort of disappear off the shelves for a couple of months in 1924, but it was back. And its early days were, by and large, most people seem to agree, the earliest days of Weird Tales were not its best, but it got its start in March of 1923, and at this stage it was mostly a magazine of horror stories. However, even here, the horror was being merged with the scientific in stories like Anthony Rudd's The Ooze, about a single-celled organism created in a laboratory that grows out of control. Another writer to appear early on was Otis Adelbert Klein, who was extremely prolific in the pulps and would end up writing a lot for Planet Stories in the 1940s. He also became editor of Weird Tales for a short time in 1924, before the magazine passed to Farnsworth Wright, who held this position during the height of the magazine's influence and quality, arguably, till 1939. So it's really the Farnsworth Wright years that are considered sort of the golden days of Weird Tales. But during the initial period we're mostly discussing now, the editorship was under the command of Edwin Baird, and Baird saw the introduction of writers like Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft, as well as some others who would essentially keep being, I guess, the top figureheads of the magazine for many years to come. There were some precursors of sorts to the Weird Tales magazine, like the Black Cat magazine from the 1910s and the Thrill Book from Street and Smith, who had previously been publishing dime novels, but moved into the pulps by the late 1910s and would eventually publish prestigious SF pulps like Astounding magazine.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting the transition from these pulp magazines going from almost like, I wouldn't say highbrow, but kind of a more general reading audience like magazines like The Strand or Argosy or whatever, to going, like you said, a really ghettoized set of publications that I think a lot of people would write it off as just being like low quality kid stuff. And you did have the dime novels from before, but it does seem like a big change, or at least a gradient going from the turn of the century to the 1920s.
The magazines like Argosy and The Strand and stuff were still being published, but it seems like before the advent of these ghettoized publications, they were more willing to publish science fiction and weird fiction and horror stories and so on. And this is kind of part of Joshi's contention, is that after these specialized magazines started to come around and these reputations started to develop, most of which were quite poor, the slicks would no longer touch this kind of material.
Right. And I think that probably fits into Butcher's complaints about Verne's reputation too, is he's probably lumped in with all these, supposedly poor quality pulp stuff, that he has the reputation of being not serious literature. We could debate his place amongst the French greats, but I think that maybe is a bit off as far as writing off that stuff goes, is it might not be a top 10 work of poetry or
Right.
prose, but it's certainly not stuff that is just like total garbage written for money. Although I'm sure those kind of stories do make their way in the pulps.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of interesting resources on the pulps that I've been looking into recently, and it really is a complicated picture, and I think a lot of it is also dependent on who is editing each specific magazine at whatever given time, and what their goals were, and what their motivation was, and how much they could pay their writers, which unfortunately did matter a great deal because there's a joke that L. Ron Hubbard kind of instigated when he created the whole Scientology thing, where he was talking to a bunch of fellow writers, and he said, we're all wasting our time writing stories for a penny a word. We should be starting cults. And so he went and did it. Penny a word is actually a high-paying pulp magazine of the 1920s and early 1930s. A lot of them were only paying half a cent a word. So that's pretty low. And so what would happen would be writers would submit their stories to the so-called better pulps, which are mostly the ones that would pay higher and also perhaps looked a little bit slicker. And if their stories got rejected there, they would just say, oh, wow, I'll try one of these then. And they'd send them to somebody else who would pay less. And so what ended up happening was some magazines would get the reject pile from authors that were maybe otherwise, maybe had a decent reputation and weren't too badly served by it. But the more they would tend to appear in these kind of publications, the less favorably they were looked upon. So many writer agents would actually discourage them from writing to certain magazines because of that. Weird Tales published a variety of things that could easily be classified under various genres. Just had to be a weird tale. So these encompassed horror, sword and sorcery, science fiction, exotic adventure tales, detectives, stories. Published early tales by Edmund Hamilton, who would later be considered the master of the classic space opera. He got his publishing start in Weird Tales, publishing a lot of early invasion-type stories, as well as the interstellar patrol tales, which were quite popular. Frances Stevens, a writer we'll be discussing very shortly, also appeared during that first year of 1923 with her Lost Race tale, Sunfire. Clark Ashton Smith, oddly enough, actually appeared in the magazine before H.P. Lovecraft, but during this time he was known for writing verse, and he didn't actually submit any fiction to the magazine until after Lovecraft had already been sort of doing it for a while.
Yeah, I was surprised at how much poetry is in the magazine.
Yeah, each issue, I think most of them, end with at least a bunch of poems. So at the back of the magazine, there's the poetry section. It's pretty cool, actually. The quality, of course, is quite variable. Lovecraft, not much of a poet. Clark Ashton Smith, though, I would say is a very good poet, as well as I can judge such things anyway. After 1954, though, of course, things were getting rough and the magazine folded. It was known, besides the sort of strange cosmic and otherworldly tales, it was, of course, recognized for its covers, many of which were designed by artists like Virgil Finlay and Margaret Bundage, the latter of whom drew all the really sexy Robert E. Howard Conan covers, which probably caused a bit of a stir at the time, but I think that it probably helped more than hurt the magazine's sales. I can't imagine, like maybe it was harder to find it on the newsstands, and they didn't get involved in another controversy early on, actually. They published a story called The Loved Dead, which was supposed to be by somebody called C.M. Eddy, but was actually ghostwritten by H.P. Lovecraft, and it was about a necrophiliac, and it pushed some buttons, and there were some efforts to take the magazine off the newsstands, and this coincidentally not long before the magazine initially disappeared for a few months as it changed publishing hands. So it's hard to say how much this was really an influence on things, but it seemed like W. Scott Poole anyway said that he thought that the controversial story did more benefit than harm to the magazine's sales in the future. There have been a few attempts to revive it ever since 1954, and it's never really lasted for very long. The quality of the efforts varies a lot, with the most recent one probably being the one that seems to stand out most. The most recent interpretation of Weird Tales, as well as the one from the late 80s, have won some prestigious awards and things. The latest iteration, although it's no longer edited by her, was initially edited by VanderMeer, and it had some pretty good print runs, but is now relegated to the status of an ebook. So it's still coming out, essentially. Not the same as it was, obviously. And nowadays, of course, the Weird Tale has come to encompass a wide variety of things, and as that really good compendium, The Weird, does show, it's quite diverse of a field, and that collection includes many writers from non-English speaking countries, not just European countries either, but there's entries from Japan and India and some African countries as well. So it's become quite broad, but there's still a certain amount of, I think, respect for the original strain of Weird Tale, which I guess you could say sort of grew up among the people that influenced Lovecraft, like Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood and Robert Chambers, and was picked up by him in the 1920s and 1930s. I'm just going to end with one more quote from Lovecraft before we get into his story, Dagon, which is kind of like the Lovecraft story, as in it was the second story he ever officially published, but it's also, in a way, sort of the instigator of every single trope that would come to be known as a Lovecraft trope in the future. So in another essay written in 1932, Notes on Writing Weird Fiction, this is what he said about himself and his own process. I choose weird stories because they suit my inclination most. One of my strongest and most persistent wishes being to achieve, momentarily, the illusion of some strange suspension or violation of the galling limitations of time, space, and natural law, which forever imprison us and frustrate our curiosity about the infinite cosmic spaces beyond the radius of our sight and analysis. So Dagon, written in 1917 and published years later in Weird Tales, 1923, the October issue, is, I think, a very important story by this writer, even though it's very short and certainly not as well known as tales such as The Call of Cthulhu, The Color Out of Space, or indeed The Dunwich Horror. And the reason for this is that we get a lot of the sort of Lovecraft obsessions that are born here, or seem to be born here. So, Lovecraft himself was born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island. His father was a traveling salesman who was confined to an asylum in 1893 after contracting syphilis and becoming demented, essentially. It's a pretty crazy story. It's kind of shocking to read about, actually, because I didn't quite know how intense it apparently was. He was quite uncontrollable, and it doesn't seem likely that his son Howard was even allowed to visit him in the asylum. And the family might have sort of tried to hush it up. Lovecraft himself certainly did, but it's pretty clear that he knew from an early age what was going on. He was a very precocious child. His mother was, I guess some might say, excessively doting and kept him from doing pretty much anything he didn't want to do, and some things that he may have wanted to do, but that she just deemed unsafe, like military service during the First World War. She did foster his intense literary and artistic interests, though, and biographer W. Scott Poole takes the position that people have been unnecessarily harsh and critical of Lovecraft's mother and her attitudes toward her son. He was a high school dropout, but very bookish from a young age. Spurned religion, preferring to lose himself in the 1001 Nights or classical Greek tales. He had a very nervous disposition, but was also oddly humorous about life. In the 20s, he started the correspondence that would mark the rest of his life, and it could be said, perhaps in a way, saved him from a somewhat solitary existence. Interesting that a lot of contemporary scholars and writers about him sort of compare a lot of what he would do 100 years ago to the social media and message boards and forums of the 21st century. So, while the perhaps somewhat callow-seeming Lovecraft seems quite far from the general doings of one William Hope Hodgson, I feel that his influence probably is quite persistent, especially in these kind of early stories and also some of the sort of sea-oriented tales that he wrote. Lovecraft also hated the sea for perhaps less personal reasons. He expressed distaste at the very smell of fish. A bit of a problem when you live so close to a seaport town. Anyway, his interest in classical art and also amateur journalism and science was pretty much the things that kept him going and kept him learning. And even though he sort of only wanted to mix with certain types of people, he certainly read a lot of books. And in the 1920s and 1930s, wrote dozens of stories that are very memorable, I would say, and well worth reading today, if you sort of are willing to take into account some of his faults as perhaps both a writer and a human being.
Yeah, the racist element of his stories and his personality certainly gets emphasized a lot by modern scholarship. And while I think those elements are certainly there, it's perhaps overstated in a way that there's a lot of science fiction-y adjacent stuff from this time and before that the racism is like way more upfront in the stories. The Edison Age is a really good example of that.
Yeah.
But I think some modern scholarship, and we'll get into this more when we talk about the story, come from the point of view that like Lovecraft's entire being and reasoning for writing these stories was all race paranoia, and he's afraid of the unknown non-white people coming to destroy everything. And I think that might be an oversimplification of what he's trying to do. I maybe some of those elements are present in some of these stories, but I don't necessarily think that's his primary motivation or reason for writing these tales in the first place.
No, I don't think that's the motivation. I think it is a part of his personality that you eventually come up against if you read into him a little more. But I know, speaking for myself, when I first read the stories, there were maybe like one or two things that raised my eyebrows a bit, but I can't say that I really noticed much about it. And that could have been because I was very young and because I'm also perhaps sheltered in my own way. But I wouldn't say, I think that most of the stories are sort of free of that kind of element, although there are little things that would make modern readers uncomfortable. Some of them are even very silly things, like the name of a cat in a certain story, which was actually the name of the Lovecraft family cat, believe it or not.
Right.
Poor cat, right? I don't know. W. Scott Poole quite vehemently attacks some of Lovecraft's positions, and rightly so. He talks about certain things like his correspondence with S.T. Joshi and how some of the older Lovecraft scholars don't necessarily want to look at that side of him very closely. And I guess I can see why, because they're really into Lovecraft, right?
Yeah.
So they don't necessarily want to see him be made to look bad in the eyes of a mainstream public that is sort of starting to recognize him.
Yeah. But I mean, at the same time, I think it's important when you're doing history to do it warts and all. You should examine the unpleasant side of things. You don't get the full picture without looking at it. And, after being aware of like a lot of the modern scholarship on the issue, I did read Dagon this time with that specifically in mind, and I look for some criticism regarding that angle. And again, we'll discuss it when we get into the story. But I think for this particular story anyway, that angle is possibly overemphasized to what's actually in the text.
Yeah, I would say there's maybe 2 or 3 stories where it really does seem to come to the fore, and you can see that he is railing against something. And this is sort of material for subjects other than the Chrononauts podcast, but I mean, there's stories like The Horror at Red Hook, which he wrote when he was in New York City, really having a bad time of it, not enjoying being in New York City at all. And it just seems like the story is him railing against everything he hates about New York. And that includes many of the immigrants who live there.
Right.
So that kind of thing, I think stories like that are generally... And there are stories that even like that story, The Horror at Red Hook, it's not really a major Lovecraft work by any stretch. Tales like The Shadow over Innsmouth, I guess you could say there's a little bit of a phobia of miscegenation, but I mean, come on, they're weird fish people, right? It's sometimes even Poole has to admit this. There's a lot of people that read a lot into Lovecraft, and sometimes a weird thing with a tentacle really is just a weird thing with a tentacle. Like, it's not meant to represent something in the real world. And I think Lovecraft himself would have been the first to say that. It's not. That he wants to be writing from... He wants to do this bridging of the two worlds thing that he talks about. He wants to create this bridge between the reality that we know and some other reality that might be a lot more unknowable and terrifying to us because we don't have the knowledge to encompass it. And he was a materialist, so his idea of the supernatural actually does, even though he was a bit of an antiquarian, his idea of the supernatural does lean a little more towards what we would consider science fiction, because to him it's more super normal. It's just things that we don't understand. It's not necessarily things that we cannot understand, but at this point, anyway, it's beyond our ken, and that's what makes it strange. You also mentioned the dream worlds. I do think they're an interesting tangent. Again, not very science fictional. I did like some of those stories a lot, but I just wanted to bring up, during this phase, Lovecraft was really sort of inspired by Lord Dunsany, and while I do still like some of those stories a lot, the dream stories, especially The Quest of Iridon, which is like really sad, I think that once I started reading Dunsany, it was kind of like, oh, so that's where he got it from. You know, it's kind of, I almost hate to say this, but I think reading the Dunsany stories kind of made me feel less inclined to like the Lovecraft dream stories, just because I feel like Dunsany was coming from I don't want to say a purer place, but it seems more original and real when he does it somehow, whereas Lovecraft, it doesn't quite seem like where he wants to be yet. That's kind of my feelings about it anyway.
Yeah, I actually haven't got around to checking him out. I've heard his name around forever, but I haven't read anything by him yet. But I'll definitely have to put him on the list.
Yeah, I haven't read anything by him yet either.
I definitely recommend that everyone read some Dunsany short stories in their life, because they're really beautiful and really transporting. So, yeah. But he also has some really funny stories as well. So I definitely think that he's worth reading. Very far from science fiction. But he might come up again, because one of the weirdest friendships ever described in genre fiction is the friendship between Lord Dunsany and Arthur C. Clarke. And that might be something we want to discuss at some point.
Yeah.
But back to Lovecraft and Dagon and Weird Tales. October 1923, 5 years after the story was originally written. And it did go through some minor revisions between its original publication in 1919. Apparently, Lovecraft sent in his original manuscript, and like many of my school teachers, Edwin Baird sent him back the manuscript with a note saying, "Please double space." And so he did, and he took the chance to just make some small revisions. From the notes in S.T. Joshi's collection, they're not serious revisions, mostly just a few word choices and things. But it's one of his first submissions to the magazine. He submitted it in a batch of 5 stories. His protagonist is a seaman who is in a garret somewhere in San Francisco. He says it's his last night on Earth. He's drug-addled and broken, but he insists that he's not a weakling or a degenerate. He really wants us to know this, because it's very important. He knows some horror awaits him, and he tells of his fate on the sea. He was a supercargo on a packet during the early days of the Great War. His ship was taken by German raiders and the men held captive, but our man was able to escape in a boat with provisions. All he knows is that he's somewhere south of the equator. It's hot, and the weather is calm, and he drifts aimlessly, hoping for rescue. He sleeps a lot, and one night he awakens. The landscape has changed all around. He's now beached, and he can see his boat some distance away, but he's lying in some sort of expanse of black mud or mire. and there are rotting corpses all around him. Mostly fish, but there are other unmentionables as well. We don't get a lot of description of that. Lovecraft sometimes doesn't tell us, and that can be frustrating, but mostly I don't mind it. It just leaves it to your imagination. I think that that's one major difference between him and Clark Ashton Smith. Smith seemed to love describing the horrible things, so he put great effort into that. But the whole aspect of the land has a very sinister quality that's quite horrifying. And there's no sign of living beings anywhere. He can't even hear the surf anywhere. And he reasons there must have been some volcanic upheaval, and he's now, somehow, on what was once the ocean floor. Though the ground is a sticky mass, it seems to be drying out, so after a few days he starts exploring. While the landscape is decidedly monotonous, he thinks he can see some sort of hummock or mound to the west, so he makes for that. And it takes him a day and a night to reach it. And by the time he gets to the base of what seems to be a tall hill, he's too exhausted and falls asleep. And he suffers terrible, wild dreams and wakes in a disturbed state, deciding to ascend now while he has the strength. And he does, and sees on the other side a vast canyon or valley far downwards. And he has odd thoughts of Paradise Lost and Satan climbing from the deepest realms of hell. Descending a slope, he can now make out a huge monolith sticking out of what seems an illimitable body of water deep within the chasm. The monolith is obviously shaped by intelligent hands, and indeed contains hieroglyphs and pictorials of a sinister aquatic nature. It's clearly very ancient, and not all creatures depicted are ones he recognizes. But some seem to resemble some of the stranger corpses he saw around him upon awakening. There are also bas-reliefs of humanoid figures with webbed hands and feet, and features Lovecraft describes as being very unpleasant. Huge flabby lips, for example. And they appear to be cavorting underwater, and something about the proportions is very strange. Is that one killing a whale? While gazing fascinatedly, this is when he sees a shape rise out of the water, huge and scaly. It drapes itself about the monument or monolith and begins to utter sounds like chanting. It sounds like a language. Is it offering prayer? He doesn't wait to find out, but runs off in terror, singing and laughing hysterically. And he makes it to the boat somehow, but doesn't remember much afterwards. Maybe there was some kind of storm, he thinks, but everything is vague till he awakens in a San Francisco hospital. His boat was picked up in mid-ocean by some Americans, and he tries to convince himself that he was dreaming while suffering in his boat, possibly under the depredations of the sun and exposure. But it's no good. He speaks with an ethnologist about Dagon, the fish god of the Philistines, but is only listened to tolerantly. He knows that somehow the thing will find him, and he decides to end his life. And I will read the last paragraph of the story, because it's pretty good, and like I was saying, I think that it really does sort of epitomize that Lovecraft feeling. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of a water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind, of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door as of some immense, slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand! The window! The window! And we can suppose from there that our man hurls himself to the street below and dies a messy and ugly death.
Yeah, tower jumper.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's your doomed Lovecraft protagonist in a nutshell, pretty much. also describing the kind of thing that Lovecraft would still be describing more or less 15 years later in more well-known stories like The Shadow over Innsmouth or The Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, no, this is a really good one and
Mhm.
short and effective. There's one description of the Fishman carvings on the monolith where he says it's beyond that of Poe and Bulwer. And I think if you combine like the coming race, the terrifying ideas that that story brings with the punchiness of Poe. I mean, Poe's best work is his 5-page stories, and this is about that length. You really get this, and it's pretty clear what the influences are, but Lovecraft makes it work in a way that I think really does rise above a lot of his contemporaries. Though I did enjoy a lot of stuff in this episode, and I've been reading a lot of horror stories lately outside of the podcast, going through The Dark Descent. There's something about Lovecraft and the way he structures his sentences and his word choice and prose. Some people find it awkward and clunky, but I think it creates this really unsettling atmosphere and mood that a lot of authors try for, but just don't kind of capture on that same level.
Yeah, I think what Lovecraft does in a lot of his stories is he just very slowly cranks the volume up until it's like really loud. I mean, a lot of the stories they just start out with this sort of intriguing, not so much this one, but a lot of them start out with an academic who has a puzzle or something like that. And he has to solve the puzzle. And then, as he solves the puzzle, he discovers more and more terrible mysteries. And the writing just sort of gets more and more feverish until you almost want to scream the last paragraphs of the story, pretty much.
Yeah, he really knows how to build the climax.
Oh, yeah. And I gotta hand it to, I have no idea who this person was, but so when I got my initial 3 Lovecraft books, right? The first one was in Braille, The Dunwich Horror, and I read that. It was like 14 volumes, really big. The second one and the third one were audiobooks. The third one was At the Mountains of Madness and Other Novels. The narrator was not very good. But the second one, Dagon and Other Macabre Tales, which of course includes this one, and also includes the Supernatural Horror and Literature essay as a sort of an appendix at the back. The narrator of that book, I don't know, he really got into it. He really did the thing. I don't know if he was a fan of Lovecraft before reading this. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. It's impossible to know because usually these things are kind of chosen at random who gets to narrate these, like especially the non-commercial talking books like this one. And yeah, he really, really got into it. He really did that thing where, yeah, like the stories start off, he does the kind of disquieted narrator, but then as things sort of start to mount and the climax really starts to build, his frenzy would really kick in. And I listened to all those tapes and I got so into the stories, and I'm sure my dad thought they were super weird when he heard them in the room too. But it's Herbert West Reanimator was in that book as well, and that's probably the most deliberately, I'm going to set out to write the most over-the-top pulp story that I possibly can version of Lovecraft. Like, it's pretty atypical of Lovecraft in the sense that I think that he's kind of in on the joke on that one, right? Like, he's kind of doing it on purpose. Just like the exclamation mark leaping off the page kind of thing, and like everybody just, the narrator just sort of screaming in frenzy about the horror of what he's found and what he's doing and all this stuff. And like, yeah, so... But this one I thought is just so interesting because it's so early for him, right? And it predates so much of what would come. It really is, I guess, a really good introduction to Lovecraft, which is weird because, like, you can't say that about a lot of his early stories. Mm-hmm. A lot of the early ones, I do feel that, in general, Lovecraft was getting better as he went. I do think that. And I know Joshi agrees with me on this. That he's just sort of, his stories did start to get more involved and complex and more interesting with their concepts, and they're playing around with weird science fiction narratives, like especially that story, The Shadow Out of Time, which is the one about the guy who's like an economics professor or something, and he ends up getting his mind swapped with an alien and from like millions of years in the past, and that while the alien lives in his body on Earth doing various strange, unknowable things, he lives in this other world that this other creature used to inhabit, along with millions of representatives of various other races in the galaxy. It's probably like one of the 2 or 3 most overtly science fiction stories Lovecraft wrote. And it's pretty much towards the very end of his career. And I think that that's sort of the direction he was heading. And I think that had he survived into the 1940s, we would have probably seen him a lot in magazines like Astounding and so forth, which was sort of the harbinger of the more thoughtful kind of American pulp sci-fi, starting in the late 30s. So that would have been interesting, and I mean, it's useless to speculate on such things, but I do often wonder what would it have been like had he survived a little longer and had a chance to write more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we'd have seen some really cool stories by him in the 1940s. But this story really is like, if somebody wanted to read something that was really short and they hadn't read Lovecraft before and they wanted to get a sense of what he would like, what he was like, I could point them to this one and say, yeah, it encompasses a lot of his themes, a lot of the things that you would see in his stories later, although they're more developed, are here.
Mm-hmm. It's basically like a blueprint for a lot of the tropes and sort of ideas that he would explore in his later works.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the brevity makes it really effective in that sense, too, is where he really gets out all those ideas quickly and doesn't have time to get lost in, maybe undeveloped prose or overthought ideas or something like that might be present in a longer work where he's first trying this stuff out.
Yeah. I think there's a little ambiguity there that I like, too, in that I don't think... I mean, in a lot of Lovecraft stories, yes, the protagonist really is doomed, and something horrible is chasing him, and then, is going to eventually destroy his mind or his soul or his body or all three. I don't know that that's necessarily the case in this one. I don't really think that Dagon is, or that the emissary of the fish people is crawling through the streets of San Francisco to get him in his apartment. I think it's probably just his broken mind playing tricks on him. That was probably the landlord coming to the door, you know what I mean?
Yeah, right, that's what I took it for, too.
But it's still cool, because you think that, well, in his mind, that thing is real, that thing is really out there, and it's waiting for him. It's like, in reality of the story, which interestingly, we don't doubt. We don't doubt his sea experience as much as we doubt his experience now of being in his apartment. And maybe part of that is how the protagonist tells us that he's become addicted to morphine now, and maybe he's having trouble distinguishing his dreams from reality. But we don't doubt the reality of his previous sea experience. We feel that, yes, he really did discover that black mire, the awful expanse of nothingness, of desolation, inhabited by dead sea creatures. That feels really real. It reminds me of unpleasant dreams that I've had too, Yeah. It's like something about that just like waking up to find yourself in this completely unfamiliar, desolate landscape. I think that's probably the most horrifying aspect of the story. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Maybe if I saw the weird scaly creature come out, I would have been like, oh, finally, somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm not alone.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is kind of funny because people make fun of Lovecraft's writing for this because, like, his protagonists are always so fearful of everything, right? Like, they're kind of turning tail and losing their minds and running at the slightest provocation. But I do think it's usually warranted. I mean, it's not like, I think it's just, the combination of all the strange things and like being in an unfamiliar place and having no idea how you got there. And then you see this weird thing come and it seems to be speaking and it's like, it eventually just became too much and he couldn't take it anymore. So I don't know. I think that it works. And I think that most of the time, the cracking of Lovecraft's protagonist, he does put a lot of work into making it feel justified.
Yeah, no, it definitely sounds like a legitimately horrifying experience, and he's able to take what's seemingly such a fantastical and out there story and just make it feel real. He's just very good at doing that.
Yeah.
One thing I mentioned earlier that I read this with the racism bit in mind in the story, and I looked up some stuff to see if there's any commentary on it from that angle, and there was somebody who argues that he was trying to convey an anti-Semitic message by making Dagon a Philistine god. Philistines were, while they were a Semitic tribe, they were depicted in the Bible as being the enemies of Israel. It seems more to me that he chose the Philistines as a way to convey like an ancient enemy of what we associate with God and goodness. The anti-Semitic thing seemed to be a bit of a stretch to me there, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that. Yeah, I don't think that that's where he was going with that. I guess the one thing that sort of made me ponder about that a little bit was how he described the flabby lips of the depicted figures,
Right.
and how that was so intensely unpleasant to him. That, again, I think it's more underlying. Like, I think it's not something Lovecraft intended to convey. I think it just says a little bit about his own personality, maybe, and preferences. I don't think that was necessarily what he was going for. I just think it was a side effect of what he was like. It tells us a little bit about him, perhaps. And yeah, it's. I think that was the only thing that really made me raise an eyebrow there. The Dagon thing too. I mean, there is a precedent for that. I think Ambrose Bierce actually has a story called "In Defense of Dagon" from the 1890s. So I don't think that it's the same kind of story, but I mean, you know, he obviously didn't pull Dagon from nothing, right? So,
and it seems like ancient gods and things like that are a pretty common theme in a lot of the works not only we're covering tonight, but that we've covered in the past before.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a whole facet of the weird story, again, because these weird gods, dwell in these sort of other realms, especially if they've been banished in the modern age, which is often the way it's been depicted, right? Is like they had their time to be here, and now their time is not now, but they are still reachable somehow. And the next story we're going to cover discusses that very thing. This is as I said, this is the Lovecraft story. This is the prototype. Not his first published. He wrote a story called The Tomb the previous month, which I also believe got published, and it's more of a gothic Poe-esque kind of tale, which he would do a few of over the next few years. But Dagon is really where the Lovecraft that everybody recognized got his start.